if an IUS delegation went abroad for an international conference, they were often asked, so what's your stance on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia? And the delegates, they were supposed to say that they have no official line.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
You are listening to the Transformative Podcast with me, Rosamund Johnston, from the rooftop of Charles University. Today with an assistant professor here, Mikuláš Pešta, who is also a researcher on the other side of town at the Institute for Contemporary History. Mikuláš has published most recently an article in the Journal of Contemporary History entitled A Hub of Anti-Colonialism, Prague's International Organizations in the Transnational Socialist Network and Global Cold War. And that's largely what we'll be talking about today. And his research focuses currently on student internationalism. So thank you very much for speaking to us today, Mikuláš.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So we're sitting here in Prague. It's a lovely sunny day. And you suggest that this was a very alluring and important place for many people from all over the world to come to during the global Cold War. In fact, you call it an important hub of anti-colonialism. I wanted to ask you what form that anti-colonialism took here.
Prague as a hub of anti-colonialism has so many levels. There were so many students from the emerging third world, from the post-colonial countries. There were workers, there were intellectuals coming here, because in many countries Prague was seen as this center of socialist thought. And there were also international organizations, the International Organization of Journalists, International Union of Students, World Federation of Trade Unions, International Marxist magazine, Problems of Peace and Socialism, briefly also World Peace Council. These organizations, they were federations of national unions of either journalists or students or trade unions, and they brought together different actors from not only from socialist countries but also from the West and from the third world. And anti-colonialism was a very important piece of their ideology or language. And I would also say that it was in the very core of their genetic information. It was really the basis on which they were built.
What did, as you say, these kind of networks and these important sites of activism all around the city mean for Prague inhabitants? Did it in fact mean anything for Prague inhabitants, or were these kind of isolated islands in a way?
It's difficult to assess because these organizations were to some extent different from each other, but I would say that they were to a large extent bubbles, that the organization didn't really come very much in touch with the local population unless the delegates really wanted to mingle with the local population. So if they didn't want, they didn't have to. Many of the delegates who spent years in Prague didn't even learn Czech because the operational languages were either English or French or Russian. That being said, there were of course cases when they interacted with the local environment. Some of the delegates that I interviewed, they said that they had many friends among Czech population. Some learned Czech or attended Czech universities or even got married to a Czech person.
If we talk about the kind of spatiality of this here, what would you say in the city were some sort of important places for this, especially student internationalism? And then I know you've written elsewhere about contact zones. Like, where would the contact zones be between these activists from all over the world and someone who'd spent their entire life, like, born and raised in Prague?
The spaces where these organizations in particular inhabited, they were the headquarters. So the International Union of Students, for example, was just a block away from here, opposite to the Faculty of Law. The International Organization of Journalists was also not far from here in Pařížská Street. But outside of that, they also, for example, could rent a hall at the Charles University for some ceremonial occasion. And of course, they also had social lives, so they visited pubs, restaurants. For example, a very popular one was the restaurant U Fleku in the new town.
So when these organizations have been written about in the past, it's very often that they're understood as like fronts, Soviet front organizations, and essentially existing to promote Soviet interests internationally. To what extent did these organizations set out to do that? And then to what extent did they set out to promote an idea or a set of ideas around decolonization internationally? And then why might we separate those two strands from each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, the general political line of most of these organizations aligned with the Soviet one. We can clearly see that in the moments of crisis, such as the Sino-Soviet crisis, where these organizations quite clearly took the position of the Soviet Union, or even before, at the very beginning of the Cold War, the split between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, or just in general, how these organizations adopted, for example, Khrushchev's strategy of peaceful coexistence, that also very clearly aligned with the Soviet line. Then in the 1970s, the Detan, in the 1980s, Gorbachev's perestroika. We can see the general history of these organizations copied what was happening in the Soviet Union. But also, these organizations were not just the secretariats. They were, and this is what I'm trying to argue, that these organizations were vast and polycentric and heterogeneous networks, bringing together various actors from all three worlds of the Cold War, and many of the actors involved in these networks had very different ideas how things should be done or what should be emphasized. So there were member unions from Ireland, for example, which had very different concepts of socialism, and sometimes member unions were not even socialist. If we talk about the international student unions, there were also Christian democratic students from Latin America, for example, or nationalist unions from Africa. And all of these, they talk to each other, and in the end, the language of these organizations, as expressed in the official publications, it aligned more or less with the Soviet Union, with the Soviet line, but the discussions within, they were much richer.
And why is decolonization in particular a kind of other alternative or interesting entry point into thinking about these richer discussions that you're talking about?
Well, I'm not trying to say that anti-colonialism is something different from the Soviet Union. Of course, Soviet Union had also a very anti-colonial foreign policy, but I'm saying that these organizations, they emphasized anti-colonialism far more, and not just anti-colonialism, but also after decolonization was over, or mostly over in the 1960s, 1970s, it promoted these various initiatives, such as the new international economic order, with which the Soviet Union had ambiguous relationship because it didn't really promote the full autonomization of the global south. But in these international organizations, we can clearly see much richer discussions about this.
If we kind of dig into these international organizations a little bit more, you mentioned one of the fault lines, but can we talk a little bit about the kind of different opinions, different points for conflict, and maybe the different hierarchies within these international organizations? You argue that they're not voting unanimously for anything. And then to what extent do sort of managers and people within the organization matter?
Well, the fault lies, for example, if we speak about Prague, we can see one of the crises was the invasion of 1968. The organizations didn't take a clear stance on it, on the invasion. For example, the World Federation of Trade Unions, it even issued a condemnation of the invasion. The International Union of Students was kind of silent on it. The president, who was Czechoslovak, Zbigniew Okrovlický at the time, he issued a statement again condemning the invasion, but then it was withdrawn because of the Soviet influence in the organization. But it was very clearly split. The language of the International Union of Students was consensual one. So if there was a topic on which there was no consensus, they just didn't address it. If an IUS delegation went abroad for an international conference or a workshop or something, they were often asked, so what's your stance on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia? And the delegates, they were supposed to say that they have no official line. And to what extent the regular people mattered, it also varied from, in the secretariats, there was only a handful of people, and they were from the whole world, and they were the ones who were actually creating the publications and the language, official communications of these organizations. But at the bigger events like the congresses, where all of the member unions gathered, the discussions were they encompassed even the unpleasant topics. The question to what extent they influence the overall agenda, that's another matter. And maybe we can say that the agenda was not so much influenced by these dissenting voices.
We've been using pretty much without fail here the term international organisation, but that's not always the term you use. You sometimes talk about these institutions as NGOs, which I think is much more a term associated with the kind of post-89 period here and civil society, whether this thing existed or not. So why did you choose a term that is so associated with post-socialist democracy to talk about the socialist period in Central Eastern Europe?
Two reasons. The first reason is that they identified themselves as NGOs. So that's a reason good enough to use it as well for us as historians. The other reason is that I really believe that it's an appropriate term even from today's point of view, because I don't mean to deny that these organizations were very much dependent on states, on the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia in particular. They were dependent on them financially and also in terms of, for example, infrastructure. They had their buildings granted by Czechoslovakia. They had their apartments, cars, all of it. It was provided by the socialist countries. But even though the state socialist member unions were very closely interconnected with the state and party structures, there were not only state member unions from state socialist countries. There were also members from the West and from the global South, and those were not always so dependent on the states. They were very much NGOs in the traditional sense of the term. And sometimes they were even illegal in their countries, especially in some of the countries of the global South, which makes the relationship between the member organizations and their respective home countries much more differentiated. And given that the socialist countries they were in a minority, even though they were the most powerful member organizations. For example, in the International Union of Students, there were 112 member organizations at the end of the Cold War, and out of that, there were only a handful of organizations from state socialist countries. So, I think to some extent, or to some in some meaning of the word, they were non-governmental, or at least they were not intergovernmental. So that's very clear that they were not intergovernmental organizations. Again, I'm not trying to say that they were independent, but the level of dependency always varies. All NGOs are to some extent dependent. So this is something that I want to also bring to the debate.
Should we still talk about Prague as a hub of anti-colonialism, or is this, do you think, kind of a closed chapter and closed with the end of the Cold War? And if the latter, then are there still, however, some important legacies from that period that still shape this city today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Prague as a hub of anti-colonialism, that's kind of a closed chapter. We don't have any important legacies. There are some communities of foreigners which survived the Cold War, most notably the community of Vietnamese workers formerly. But in terms of the international organizations, I think not much is left of this history. These NGOs, they left the country or ceased to exist altogether. Of course, the buildings, and there are some physical traces of the history of these NGOs. But in general, the new country, the new Czechoslovakia, it turned quite hostile against these organizations, and there were some legal battles even when the new political representations tried to chase them out. Yeah, so in this sense, I don't think there is any legacies being alive very much. Prague kind of became a hub of anti-communism instead of a hub of anti-colonialism.
All right, Mikuláš Pešta, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.